that doesn't.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and get started here. If you want to find your seats, wrap up your conversations. Okay, Josh, you want to go ahead and take the roll call, please?
Senator Bouchard? Here. Senator Cox? Here. Senator Moniz?
Here.
Senator Steinmetz? Here. Representative Blake?
Excused, isn't he?
Excused.
Representative Clausen?
Here.
Representative Haley?
Excuse.
Excused.
Representative Henderson?
Excused. Excused.
Representative Larson?
Here.
Representative Simpson? Here. Representative Tax? Here. Representative Winter? Here. Co-chairman Hunt?
Who?
Co-chairman Bowman?
Here.
I have a quorum.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to Laramie. It's good to be here at this beautiful campus. Go ahead, and it looks like we have a few county commissioners at least. So we'll any county commissioners, other elected officials, feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves. We'll go ahead and embarrass you right up front here. See, you're up, Mr. Espy, or you're in front.
John Espy, Darwin County Commissioner.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Uh-huh.
Terry Jones, also county commissioner. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Oh,
Terry Johnson, Albany County School Board.
all right. Good deal. All right, looks like we're in good shape there. So, like I said, it's really neat to be here in Laramie in the fall, and beautiful day for a meeting. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Got some bread and butter land management, resource management issues up today. So, that being said, the first up is OSLI. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion on the federal and state land swap, and just a little bit of an update from my end. I have been talking to Representative Cheney's office. They are looking at getting that process started again. There's just a massive land management bill that passed in last March, so unfortunately we missed that train, but we're going to be looking for the next one that comes around. And so not a huge rush from what I understand in terms of coming together with specific proposals. We'll be looking for that at our October meeting. So that'll be the culmination of our work for the interim, at least, on that topic. But overall, I'd just like to reinforce it's a very long process, even once we get federal legislation passed. And it's not the only process that deals with land management issues in the state of Wyoming, as was pointed out at our last meeting. So with that being said, I know the county commissioners have been working on wilderness study areas, and from what I understand, I'll let you describe it, Mr. Ryman and Mr. Espy, but basically encouraging that we make decisions on those study areas and don't study them indefinitely, from what I understand. And of course that relates to a lot of the issues that we have with these isolated school parcels that are supposed to be raising revenue for our schools but are not, due to their being surrounded by federal land, which is suppressing any sort of serious economic activity and revenue generation. So I think that there's an intersection here between our work and the county commissioners' work, and so we'll go ahead and have the county commissioners present any information they feel is appropriate, and I look forward to perhaps working together on these issues. Yep, go ahead. Yeah, either one of you, come on up.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Jeremiah Riemann. I'm here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association, and I do have one of my commissioners to join me in this conversation, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Mr. Co-Chairman's Committee. I'm John Espy, Carbon County Commissioner. I was also the chairman of the Carbon County WPLI process.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll give some opening remarks, and then I'll ask Commissioner Espy to talk about the process that Carbon County went through to come to the conclusion that they did, which has been subsequently forwarded to our office and then to our congressional delegation for them to pursue. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to start with just a little bit of background on wilderness study areas. The Federal Land Management, FLPMA, Land Management Policy Act of 1976 required the BLM to go through a process of inventorying lands across the U.S. For wilderness characteristics, and they were to provide that report to Congress, I believe by 1991. And in that report, they were to identify areas that had those characteristics of naturalness, solitude, and a few other criteria. And to give, they had to be of certain size, generally of 5,000 acres or larger, and they were to give a recommendation for wilderness or recommendation for release for other uses that might exist on the landscape or of the values that existed there. They were never intended to be permanent. That was a recommendation for Congress to make a decision about how those lands would be used. Would they be designated as wilderness, or would they be released, again, back to broader public uses? In some states, Congress acted fairly quickly. Counties and others went through processes and gave recommendations, and again, Congress acted. In Wyoming, that wasn't necessarily the case, and because there hasn't been action on those have remained managed for those wilderness characteristics since that submission in 1991. In Wyoming, there are currently 42 Bureau of Land Management wilderness study areas. There are also a few wilderness study areas, 3 in the state, that exist on U.S. Forest Service lands. The process is a bit different when it comes to Forest Service lands and the designation of those, but we do have some of those lands in existence. For some time, the state has had an interest in trying to pursue a final determination, a final decision on those wilderness study areas that exist in Wyoming, and the county commissioners working with the governor's office began conversations about how to pursue moving forward in a collaborative way and making some decisions around that. I'll admit, from my time in the governor's office, it was very of high interest to us, but we were at capacity on a number of other issues, so we were never able to really carry forward in defining and setting out a collaborative process. And I'll really compliment the County Commissioners Association and Pete Obermueller at the time came forward and began to set out some decisions around what that would look like and begin to give the county commissioners a collaborative process to move forward, provide some parameters around who should be a part of that public process, to make decisions about the lands, that it should include the resource users, potential resource users, perhaps environmental or conservation interests, and try and bring all of them around a common table to make a decision about what should happen there. And it wasn't just about should it be wilderness or should it be released. It was, are there other opportunities that exist here? There are a number of other designations that can be applied to lands or Perhaps you want to have wilderness in a particular part of it, but you want to have a road and maintain it for agricultural uses or allow for fences and some other mechanical uses that perhaps don't exist under the Wilderness Act. It really is an opportunity for all of us to make decisions and give that recommendation to Congress. The intent as part of the process was that the counties would go through that process, that the recommendation would then go to the Board of County Commissioners. The Board of County Commissioners would, in public, make a decision about what their recommendations were going to be, forward that to the County Commissioners Association, where we would then draft legislation, or at least the framework for what the legislation would look like, giving consideration to all of those processes, and then ultimately forward that on to Congress. It was a decision of the county commissioners on whether to participate, and not all counties elected to participate as part of this process, but that was their decision on whether they wanted to do that. Ultimately, that package was submitted to the association late last year, and Pete Obermuller did craft the framework for that legislative package. It has been submitted to our congressional delegation, and it's now in their hands to craft the legislative language that will ultimately be used to make decisions about that. We'll say that not everybody is happy about all of the decisions that were made as part of that process. Some would criticize whether it was collaborative in every instance, but I think having everybody around the table certainly provided for better outcomes, better decisions in the process, and we have something that we can work with and hopefully begin to finally release or designate some of these areas based on those recommendations. So, Mr. Chairman, just to allow you to have a better perspective from the ground, from somebody that participated in the process, I've asked Commissioner Espy to kind of give that perspective if I can. And I do have, for your benefit, a list of frequently asked questions and the answers that were put together by my predecessor relative to this process, and I'll give that to your staff so that you can have that. And I will say that there is also a link on our website. If you go to our main wyo-wcca.org website, there is an initiatives page, and you can dig into all the details of every single one of these wilderness study areas through a mapping software that exists there. You can find all of the information relative to the processes that existed in your counties, if your counties happen to have these features there, and we'll be happy to provide any information that we can. At this point, I'll hold back on providing the legislative language until the congressional delegation has that package put together.
Any questions for Mr. Ryman before we? Okay, I have one. Is there a timeline for when that package may see the light of day in Washington?
Mr. Chairman, my expectation is really any day. I talked to Senator Barrasso's office, who is taking the lead on this, about a month ago, and they felt they were within reach of having the final language put together such that we could then share that with our teams that on the ground so that they can confirm that the legislative language conforms with the recommendations that they made. But they're also trying to work across the aisle, working with the various agencies, in particular the Bureau of Land Management, to make sure that they get the right language there and the conveyances are appropriate. So, again, I'd hope to have it soon and be able to circulate that.
Okay, and just in terms of when it would, what's the plan? Is it for it to be attached to an existing piece of legislation? Is it going to stand on its own? What's, in terms of the process moving forward? That's an important milestone to have the language ready, but is there any timeline for when the legislation may be passed?
Mr. Chairman, that's a wonderful question, and my expectation is that it will not be a standalone bill, that it will ultimately be attached to something else. It's just standard process these days. And our hope is that the whole package goes as one, that all of what we put forward is considered as part of that process. But I understand that there are some political wranglings that have to happen occasionally on these things, and it's entirely possible that one portion of it could be picked up and moved, and other pieces left for additional consideration, perhaps as a part of another package, maybe as additional work in the collaborative, but I do anticipate that it'll be a part of something bigger.
Okay, well, if we don't have any further questions, we'll go to Mr. Espy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our county started the process off by advertising for, I guess I'll back up. We sat down and figured out what we wanted for a committee, and I want to say it was 7 plus the 2 commissioners. Then we advertised out and really sent out to all the NGOs and everything to get participation, to the local stock growers, mineral industry, the local recreationists to go that. Then we went through all those applications and we picked our committee from that. So we had quite a wide base of people on that committee and from interests. Then when we went through it, we decided to essentially go with, and the term is escaping me now, and I'm sorry, a consensus-based decision-making process for this. And those of you that have been through that process know that is a slow, arduous process, but in the end, we did come out with 3 recommendations. 2 of those were for wilderness in the Encampment River, and then over on the Prospect. The Prospect, that was a very simple one. The grazing permittee on that one wanted to see it become wilderness, due mainly to over recreation in the area, and they wanted to kind of see that brought back and pulled back in. The Encampment River that one was pretty much going to be what it is. Unfortunately, we couldn't attach it to the Forest Service wilderness area due to some private land issues in that just wasn't going to work out. Over on Bennett Mountain, we took another route where we went for a special management area. Essentially what we did there for mainly view purposes and that, and bighorn sheep usage is no surface occupancy on it, but the grazing permittee and the agency could still go up and use the roads and do, say, spring developments need to happen or that, those sort of things could happen which would not be allowed under a wilderness designation. The 4th one on our list, the Ferris Mountains, we could not come to a consensus, so we felt it was just best to leave that as a WSA for this time. There was a lot of discussion around that, and just the 2 sides couldn't come to an agreement. Now so I guess that's kind of where we got where we were. We came out with real good consensus on that, a lot of support from both the industry and NGOs for our proposal that we came up with.
Any questions, committee? Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. I guess you got off easy. So I appreciate your work and look forward to seeing how we might be able to work together on these issues moving forward. So we'll be in touch, and we'll be in touch with Senator Barrasso's office as well. So.
Sorry, one more thing if I can. We're happy to provide any of the resources that we develop to move this process forward. As part of it, when counties were making that decision of whether to participate or not to participate, we did host a conference where we brought together all the parties and went through what the possibilities were. Should you use a facilitator? Should you not? Who are possible facilitators? What does designation look like? Can you go some other directions? And we'd be happy to provide that as a resource and all the other things that have been developed. As I said, I do have for you the question and answer. If that sparks any additional questions, let us know. It's been a 3 or 4 year process to get to this point, to get those recommendations put together, and it was intended to try and hit on consensus where possible in these decision-making processes, leaving the final decision ultimately to the county commissioners, but we wanted to have a shared decision-making process in this as much as possible, but make anything that we have available to you.
That'd be great. All right, thank you. Do we have anybody from the Forest Service here by chance? I know that they may have been able to make it, but if not, we're saving our federal partners for that October meeting, and where we'll talk a little bit more about the actual nuts and bolts of the process of doing a land exchange, along with our, obviously, OSLI. So with that, is there any public comment on the land exchange process as we continue to look forward to some movement in this area? Does State Lands have anything to say? Probably should have asked you first, but you're good? Okay. There's no public comment at all. Okay, all right, we'll keep on looking forward to the next meeting on this. Like I said, very long process, but something I think has a clear benefit to the state of Wyoming. So next up, we have OSLI land appraisal process. State Lands, do you have anything to say on this matter that to kind of kick us off here?
Mr. Chairman, I'm Jennifer Scoggin. I'm the new Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments, and I'm pleased to appear before you all today. I apologize, I wasn't here for the last meeting. I was at the Oil and Gas Commission so that they could have a quorum that day. With respect to the OSLI appraisal process, I do have Assistant Director Ben Bump and Dave Bartlett, one of our appraisers here, to answer any additional questions that the committee might have. I am aware that they did a pretty comprehensive presentation to the committee last time, so rather than waste everybody's time with a repeat, we would just stand for questions should anybody have anything at this point.
Any questions, committee? Okay, I have one or two.
Okay.
So as you're well aware, we're kind of struggling with what happens when there's just a disagreement on the land appraisal. And so the question I have is what role does the SLIB play, if any, in adjudicating those disagreements? I'm assuming there's nothing that would prevent somebody who's not happy with your internal process to go before the SLIB. Is that correct? That option is available to anybody, is it?
Mr. Chairman, I would invite my colleagues to come up, but in any event, I did want to say that at this point, we do not have an appeal process related to the appraisal process. Once the appraisal is done, there is a review appraisal process that then occurs so that there can be dialogue to try to reach consensus and understanding about where the appraisal is. And that's for a variety of reasons, and I think as was explained previously, with the USPAP process, you can't sort of insert different procedures in order to continue to have the reliability of that appraisal. One thing that I will note is that the Board of Land Commissioners, they are not appraisers themselves, so they do not have the skill or the background to be able to determine what makes one appraisal better than another. They rely on the Office of State Lands as their staff to help determine that and to review and analyze the appraisals. Also, the Board of Land Commissioners, they are in a fiduciary role. So arguably, even if they were presented with two competing appraisals, they may be obligated to take the higher one just as in that fiduciary role to make sure that they're doing what's in the best interest of the trust beneficiaries. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bump and Mr. Bartlett. You guys have any further comment? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would, to add on to what Director Scoggin was speaking of, I would come back to the flow chart that we talked about at the last meeting with the exchange, the whole exchange process. And so once appraisals are finalized, once they've gone through the process of the back and forth with reviewers and looking at them, they would be part of a large detailed analysis done by the Trust Land Management Division. And so that analysis would go through and look at all the values, look at all of the pieces of the puzzle. That gets published out to the public. And so there's a big review period, a 30-day comment period, where comments regarding the appraisals would be available at that point in time, prior to moving into that second board meeting. So ample opportunities once the appraisals are finished in the detailed analysis process and the board process.
Okay, any questions? Committee? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been struggling with this issue for quite some time. Do you have any recommendations on what the best process would be to mediate any differences between landowners in the state on the values of the appraisals on the land?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, at this point, I don't have a real recommendation with respect to mediating any kind of difference of opinion. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind here that, again, the Board of Land Commissioners is in a fiduciary role and is looking out for the best interest of the trust beneficiaries. And we simply don't have to sell or exchange the property if, in fact, we disagree with the valuations. And same on the other side with the applicant proponent. Should they disagree with the appraisal and the appraisal process, they don't have to go forward either. It's a willing buyer, willing seller scenario and situation.
I understand that, but we're continually, at least I am continually getting pushback on number one, the amount of time it takes to get one done, and then I understand your role in the process, but we have constituents that are quite frustrated over the process as it takes place. I hear what you're saying is if you don't like it, don't do it. And therein lies the frustration for us and our constituency is they'd like to see it done. A classic example is this Pilot Peak project that you're working on now, and that is going to be a follow-up question, is where we stand on that project as well. But we are, as legislators, certainly struggling to find a way. But we had considered some sort of a mediation process and put it in statute, but whatever we do, we'd like it to be right and work for all parties involved. So that's our frustration with that issue.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz. So I guess thinking about this, I would speak to sort of what are more traditional, more standard type exchanges, generally involving a single 640 acre section or smaller tracts. In very, very large, complicated exchanges that contain, 30, 40 parcels of land, that's an anomalous situation. So with Pilot Hill, it's a complex, very, very large appraisal. To speak to your question of the status of it, we're currently still working, finalizing reports, working on the review comments that we've received. One of the main review comment that we received on the initial draft that we shared with the reviewer was that we tried to do it too quickly, and that big of an appraisal needed additional time to really gather thorough sales data. So that's what we've been doing with those appraisals for the last few months, is bolstering our sales data, looking high and low, working to interview people that have been involved with sales, to strengthen those reports, to add additional sales data to those reports based on those comments. Additionally, the appraisal assignment grew. We were assigned additional parcels to appraise as part of this process. So we've added parcels in recently that are currently being appraised as well. We have 4 appraisers working on this 100% at the moment, and we're very hopeful that these appraisals are all completed very soon.
Just to follow up a little bit, the main concern that we hear from our constituency anyway is that the appraisals between private landowners' land and state land, the appraisal is considerably different, and the values were, and that's the dispute over how their land was valued as opposed to state land. And that's what, at least I'm struggling with, on how we solve that issue. What's your take on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, we have initial draft of the appraisal that went out, and that's the beginning of that process. So those were not complete, that was not a complete value opinion at that point in time. It wasn't a concluded value. So we don't have those values totally pinned down yet because we've been adding additional data to remedy some of those comments that are in the review. So as you compile more and more data and more sales, those values change. So the initial values were based solely on the information that was available at that moment when we put that draft out. We've had a lot of additional time, and there's a lot more information that will be leading to those final values at the time when they're completed.
One follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Have you seen the draft bill we have in front of us today? Have you seen the draft bill we have in front of us today? Director, do you have any comments on the LSO had some comment on that as the bill states that we're going to expedite the process. And LSO's question is, you might define what expedite means. Do you have any view or ideas on how that process might take place?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, we have talked internally about the bill, and I understand that, Mr. Chairman, that's sort of the next issue to come forward. What we're talking about with expediting the process, it's on sort of the smaller, isolated parcels. Is there a way to get a value for value exchange without going through the full appraisal process, be it some sort of market analysis or a broker's report or something like that? And we can certainly get into more detail about that if you want, Mr. Chairman, now, or if you want to wait until that topic comes up. But that's mainly what we're discussing in different situations, not something like Pilot Hill, which is more complex.
Yeah, we'll probably have some public comment on this particular issue in committee discussion before we move on to the draft bill. But,
okay. Yeah. And Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Bartlett would also maybe like to follow up on Senator Moniz's question.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman and Senator and members of the committee, my name is Dave Bartlett, and I am one of the appraisers at the state of Wyoming. I've been there only 3 years. Before that, I was in private practice. A couple things, if you'd like to drill down a little bit further. It's not uncommon to have people with differing opinions when they look at an appraisal as far as what value is. One of the things that we run into is if you have landowners that have just purchased a piece of ground from their neighbor and it sells at a certain price, they feel that that is the value of their ranch overall. Necessarily is not market value. It is a sale, but it necessarily is not market value. What we try to do with your state lands, with the trust state lands, is find sales that are current, that are representative of what's happening in the market. On this particular assignment, we're being told by various people, probably the same constituents that you're referring to, that we use sales from 2014. That's not something that we are told to do, that we follow through on. We use market sales. We have done studies to say, okay, what's happening with Wyoming land values? Farm Credit Services of America has studies that they do regularly, their benchmarking programs. I'm a member of that cooperative, so I get their newsletters. What you will see is sales from 2009 to roughly 2014 actually saw a reduction in values. If you go from 14 to 19, you see an increase in values. That's documented with the Federal Reserve of Kansas City. It's documented with Farm Credit Service of America. It's documented with the National Ag Statistics Service. Values have increased. So through this whole process, we're being told, hey, here are sales from 2014. Use them. No, that's not what we're going to do here. We're going to use current sales that we have, and that's going to be representative of what we do. Secondly, we're dealing with some state relics here. We have state lands in the trust that have live water, that are in primary elk parturition areas. They're in calving areas for elk. If we're expected to give these lands away, that's a different story. But we're trying to value these at market. And if there are landowners out there that think that state trust lands are not worth anything, or they're worth what they gave to their neighbor, neighbor to neighbor sales are not always representative of what the market is. So we use market sales. As Mr. Bump said, we just got approximately 6,000 acres added to the list to appraise. So it is kind of a long, arduous project here. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions for OSLI on this land appraisal topic? Okay, thank you. Maybe stand
Thank
close
you, Mr.
by.
Chairman.
We'll see if there's any public comment on this issue. Any members of the public want to testify?
Good morning, Chairman Boner, members of the committee. Tammy Johnson with Wyoming Education Association. Some of the comments that were made early this morning and the beginning of your presentation was about the trust and these lands that are locked up or inaccessible, generating revenue for the trust. When I look at the proposed legislation, subsection B on page 3, prioritizes the exchange of lands to facilitate public access to state lands. And I want to just refocus you on the priority is not to give access to state lands, but to allow for a generation of revenue for the school trust. So objecting, I guess, in concept to that being a priority, that we want to expedite the trade just so we can give public access to state lands, school trust lands is what they actually are, trust lands, isn't the primary focus. It's to get the highest appraisal, to get the right exchange. We want to see these lands exchanged so we can generate revenue, but we want to see that done with integrity for the trust and generating revenue for the trust, not to give access and that's secondary purpose to the school trust land. So I just wanted to remind you of that and say I don't think that subsection change in this statute addresses the real intent of the trust.
Okay, all right. Appreciate that. Any questions, committee?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. We'll be sure to take that into account as we move on to the draft bill. So right now we're looking at the land appraisal process and the issue here for those who I guess just as a reminder, the issue here is the question is what do you do when there's a difference of opinion over, you want to put up a parcel for exchange with state lands, and there's a difference of opinion when it comes to the appraisal, and I imagine that, certainly there's lots of well-defined processes, but ultimately, they can be subjective as well. And so that's the question, is what do we do when there's a difference of opinion on the appraisal, and is there any mechanism that we should consider to adjudicate those disagreements? And so that's the question here. So have been expecting a little bit more public comment. A lot of those issues we're dealing with this community, but if there's no further public comment on the land appraisal process, we could go ahead and move on to the next topic under state lands. Unless the committee, do you have any discussion on land appraisal?
Well, I guess, for the committee at least, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the dilemma we're faced here, and we've talked about this now for off and on for a year or two. What might your thoughts be on this issue as far as moving forward or not moving forward with anything? There apparently is none. So I think we're where we are with this, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
And we'll wait and see.
Right, and that's the only thought that I had was whether we want to specify in statute that if there is a disagreement, a petitioner could bring it before the Board of Land Commissioners as a neutral third party. And I think state lands points are well taken that they're going to be relying on their state lands appraisal during that process. But then again, there has to be, I think from our perspective, it's important that we set up a process by which if somebody feels like they are wrong, they can be heard out. They have an opportunity to be heard. Now, you could argue that they have that opportunity right now. There's nothing to prevent them from going to that public meeting and presenting that information right now. So that's kind of the only possible action I think we could take as a legislative committee, and just like to have a little bit of discussion on it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I guess I would just say ditto to that, and to answer Senator Moniz's query there, I think that it is a worthy issue of further discussion, and that whatever we come up with, some form of action needs to be taken, just concerning, I guess from my perspective of what I experienced and got to learn a little bit about last spring, sitting in on those meetings toward the end of the session, that we definitely need to discuss this further and preferably come up with some legislation to address the concerns of landowners and to fully reevaluate that process. So, yeah.
I don't want to put Commissioner Jones on the spot, but Commissioner, do you have any thoughts on your frustrations in the process on the Pilot Peak project, or any suggestions you might have as to how we move forward on this issue?
Chairman and Senator Moniz, there are frustrations that landowners have had and expressed with the inequities that they feel take place between the state lands and the private sector. I attended a meeting at the last legislative session where people were very, very upset and felt that there needed to be a method to bring the two closer together. As far as how the Pilot Hill project has moved along, I think it's been incredibly frustrating for the public not knowing what's going on the inside. But this project is so huge that to be where we are in 2.5 years compared to projects of this size that might take 10 or 12 years to do, we're making great progress. But I do think we need to address the issues of the difference between what the public feels their land is worth and what state lands feels their land is worth, so that projects like this can happen in the future. Did that answer your question?
I guess it did. That's what we've been hearing everywhere, at least my constituency in Albany County. I've been hearing that for quite some time. And I guess as legislators, we're just going to have to figure out what we can do to try to help mediate the process. Understanding, and I do understand the state's role in this whole process.
Oh, I do too.
And that is, puts us as legislators in the middle, actually. So we'll see what we can figure out, but that's our frustration as well, so thank you.
Well, and I understand both sides' frustration, as I know that you do too, so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry
thank
to
you.
put you on the spot.
Any questions, committee, before you go? Oh, okay, guess not. Okay, committee, so it's up to you, and certainly defer to folks who have more experience dealing with these issues on the committee, but if we're going to pursue legislation as a committee, we have to vote to draft it here today. So we can continue discussions less formally. We can continue to advocate for our constituents. We could give ourselves the option of pursuing draft legislation at our next meeting. So it's I defer to the committee on this one, whatever the will of the committee is. Representative Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I'm still considering what Ms. Johnson's comments were about the specific wording there on line 22 and 23. The purpose of this draft legislation is to...
Sorry, Representative, we're not quite, sorry, I should have been more strict at the outset. We're not quite to the draft bill yet. We're still on the land appraisal process. And so I apologize. I should have made that more clear as chairman. But so we're just talking about what happens, conceptually when there's a difference of opinion as to a land appraisal during the land exchange process. So, okay, sorry about that. Okay, so, okay.
Josh, I hate to put you on the spot as well, but do you have any feeling or thoughts on this issue?
Mr. Chairman, in large part, I would defer to the Office of State Lands. Certainly, if you look at some of those constitutional provisions, they're required to appraise the property, and so they would, to a large extent, be required to rely on that appraisal. Certainly, providing some sort of process where you could have a formal hearing and at least talk it out. I don't think that would conflict with that process. What that would look like, we could certainly draft something up and get you something to look at, get some comments on it.
I guess from my position, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to see us do that. But if the committee's willing to move forward on it, I'd like to see Josh draft something. If not, I'll do it individually maybe. So.
Okay, so is that a motion?
That's a motion.
Draft a bill that would allow when there's a disagreement, that disagreement be brought before the Board of Land Commissioners, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and seconded by Senator Cost. Okay, any discussion on that motion to just get a draft bill going that allow for the Board of Land Commissioners to adjudicate any disagreement between state lands and a petitioner for a land exchange? Go ahead. Senator Stowns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a good idea, and in 36-1111A, which is not contained in our bill, but if you go back to statute, I think it would feather in quite nicely into the other powers we've already given them to, with regards to valuation and all of the other land exchange procedures. So I think it would be an easy, maybe even a few words we could put into statute that already exists. Thank you.
Okay. Any further discussion, committee? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
All right.
Opposed, say no. Okay, that motion carries. We'll look forward to that bill draft at our October meeting. So, moving forward, now we're on to the draft bill, voluntary land exchange process. And this is different because, we're looking to expedite the process where there presumably is relatively little controversy in the hopes of moving an isolated state parcel to a place where it has public access. So, Mr. Anderson, would you like to go ahead and introduce this draft piece of legislation to us?
So, Mr. Chairman, this bill came out of our first meeting up in Sheridan. Just discussion of providing some sort of an expedited process. So I included there mostly on page 2 and over onto page 3 as to the existing exchange process, just so you could take a look at that, see what the current process is. Then this bill adds a new subsection B starting on page 3, authorizing the Board of Land Commissioners to develop an expedited exchange process for private lands on a value basis if the board determines that the exchange of lands would facilitate public access to state lands, including exchange an isolated parcel for parcels contiguous with other state lands. Fairly straightforward as far as that goes. You'll see in the staff comments there, it provides very little direction for what you might want that process to look like, how it would be different from the current process, but does give them the ability to do it. Excuse me. But if you wanted to provide some more direction there, that might be appropriate. And then also note, as Director Scoggin noted there, that last line, they do have constitutional requirements on how to manage these lands. And so to the extent, the expedited process wouldn't be able to go beyond their constitutional duties related to the management of the lands.
Okay, so just so I understand, it would not allow them to say, promote an exchange that would diminish revenue to the state or to school trust. Is that correct? So,
yeah, I don't believe it would allow them to go beyond their, their constitutional requirements on how to manage that land.
Okay. But it would be beneficial to specify perhaps that, say specifically, even though it should be, taken care of by our Constitution, that no land exchange will diminish or return, and along with maybe a few other things that would provide more direction to state lands.
Sure, yeah, that would be certainly useful just to include in there to avoid any concerns that might be brought.
Okay, gotcha. Any questions, Committee? Senator Simons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we go back to Section A and the small Romanettes 2 and 3, to meet a specific need of the school or community for the land, or to better meet the multiple use objectives for the benefit of the trust, do you think that might cover the concerns that were raised, or do you think we need it in B2 because that was in Section A?
Sure, and you'll see, Mr. Chairman, that on page 3 there, lines 21, 22, that they're, in addition to meeting the requirements of subsection A, where they would have to find that the exchange is necessary for one of those items, that it would also be to facilitate public access. So they would still have to meet the requirements of subsection A. But if there are concerns, it certainly wouldn't hurt to add it to this subsection as well.
Okay, Committee, any questions? Representative Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to quantify. What we're trying to accomplish here is to allow the Board of Land Commissioners to be able to promulgate new rules that on very simple cases we can process them more rapidly, just simply value for value exchanges. This does benefit our school trust lands because right now those parcels that are completely isolated have a low lease value and a very, very low value for the actual value of the assets. By acquiring by flipping lands and doing what we need to so that we end up with a parcel of land that has access by the public. That doesn't necessarily mean the public, everyone can access it, but certainly an access so that the leasee or the land managers have access and can utilize the property. That's going to significantly increase both the value of the lease and the value of the land, which ultimately will benefit our schools. And so I think we're covered already with the line 22 and making sure that we're addressing the right purpose, and that's the intent of the proposed draft. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Any further discussion, committee questions for our staff attorney? Okay, and so, Mr. Anderson, just to be clear, you think that we probably need to do a little bit more work on this draft bill before we, it's not, it's maybe, it needs a little bit more work before it's ready for prime time, as we say?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I mean, it certainly works as drafted. I mean, I think it gives them the opportunity to, the ability to do this expedited process. Just if you wanted any more clarification of what you wanted that process to look like, that's not in here right now, but it certainly gives them the power to set something up if they find an opportunity to do so.
Okay. Any further questions, committee? All right, thank you, sir. Okay, we'll go to state lands and investments. Do you have any comments on this proposed piece of legislation?
Mr. Chairman, it's the position of the Office of State Lands and Investments that this addition to the existing statute 36-111 is unnecessary. We think that the statute is already broadly written enough. If you look in your draft bill on page 2, lines 15 through 18, it says the Board of Land Commissioners is authorized to promulgate rules and regulations necessary to implement the exchange of state lands on a value-for-value basis. To us, that includes all types of exchanges, including an expedited exchange. We think that this concept would be better addressed through the rulemaking process. We believe the board is already authorized under this statute to in fact promulgate those rules, and the concerns about public access and the sideboards that are sort of put around this in lines 22 through line 2 on pages 3 and 4, those are already addressed in Romanet 1 through 4, where there has to, in order to do the exchange, the board has to find that it's necessary to do one of those 4 items. So we think that this is already encompassed in existing statute, and that this would be better handled through the rulemaking process. And Deputy Director Crowder here has some ideas on that, and I'll turn it over to him.
Mr. Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have taken direction from the committee, as this is an important topic for you, and have drafted rules and plan to present those to the board sometime into the future. But the important topics of those rules in our existing, I believe it's Chapter 26 of the Board of Land Commissioners rules, this would be the last section inside of that, Section 9. But what we would contemplate in those rules is that all proposals would go through the existing trust land management objectives. And those are given to us by the Romanets that Director Scoggin has already mentioned, and that we further defined through the board, that they've approved those trust land management objectives, where the first objective is to increase annual revenue, maintain or increase annual revenue, maintain and increase value. The second objective is to increase the efficiency of management, and the third objective is to increase or help a community in some sort of need, and that's where the public access typically comes into play. So all of the proposals we'd get through an expedited process would still go through those lenses to see how they treat or are treated through those trust land management objectives. The second would be that all other processes would remain the same. Obviously, we need to have a value there. We need to determine that value. We need to have a public process. We need to have the Board of Land Commissioners weigh in at the expected times that are currently written in statute. And so all of those would remain the same. Additionally, those lands, as you've heard in previous testimony in Sheridan, go through an exchange process where it goes through an internal review within our office. It's called the Internal internal review team. And at that point, we're contemplating that we, as the internal review team and the directors, the final decision maker in there, would decide if a transaction was ripe for an expedited process or not. There are parcels that are complicated, just like the Pilot Hill Exchange we're talking about today, that wouldn't merit this type of process. But those small 40 acres or less, maybe up to 640 acres, completely isolated and surrounded by an existing landowner, and he has identified lands on the periphery of his ranch or ones with accessibility of some kind, those would seem right. But we take that step in that internal review team process to make that determination of which path it should go to. And we'd make that recommendation to the Board of Land Commissioners at their first meeting of any exchange, just like the existing process contemplates. I want to say that probably or there's two areas that we could expedite the process. One is the valuation of a parcel, and the second is the public comment period. The public comment period is given to us as a requirement in statute that we contact the local county commissioners to determine if a public hearing is warranted. The Board of Land Commissioners has taken that extra step to require that to happen, so we do contact the local county commissioners, but we go ahead and have that meeting irrespective of what they determine to be appropriate. In this situation, we may just lean back on that and say, if the county commissioners would like a hearing on it, then we'll go ahead and do one. If they don't, then we can shorten that down to a 30-day public comment period from our original 60-day public comment period and expedite that public comment process. The second way is to shorten that value discussion a little bit. So we've had a lot of conversations about appraised value and how we determine that fair market value. This could be a shortening of time, or it could be a lengthening of time, just like we talked about. If we have a mediary step in there, we could be at the same point we are right now. But in the rules that we're drafting currently, we're contemplating just setting a price opinion of a region, of a certain characteristic of a parcel, having our appraisal staff just do an initial review and set that price opinion and go from there. No further appraisal would be needed. We need the board to decide if that was an appropriate price to move forward with or not, but to shorten that. So it also, in our process, wouldn't preclude a proponent from deciding to go through an appraisal process should they determine that our value is not appropriate. Obviously, as Director Scoggin and others have mentioned today, we have a constitutional mandate to sell all state trust land at its highest value. So that means that our price opinion is likely going to be a little bit higher just to make sure that we're meeting that mark. And so there may be some discrepancy there, and there may be individuals who'd like to go down the road of a true appraisal, which then we wouldn't be shortening the time, but we'd give them the option if they'd like to. And with that, that would be the things that would shorten the time, that would expedite it. We see there to be some considerations that should be considered by all parties involved, including the legislature and the board, but there may be an effect to the tax base in the county if we cross county lines, and that's an existing consideration now. Also, when these lands become more accessible, just like Representative Simpson mentioned, they do become more valuable. They become more valuable to additional users. So those proponents may have a situation down the road where conflicting grazing lease applications occur on their grazing rights, and that's an expected and realized thing on all accessible state lands. Also, commercial opportunity increases. You have access to public roads, so ancillary oil and gas activities increase. Hopefully through my time we have some kind of commercial development like a hotel or a Walmart on state lands to increase revenue. But when you have access through a public road, that opportunity presents itself at a greater extent, and I'm not sure if proponents know or feel like that's a real risk when they're entering into this type of situation. And again, our $1,000 application fee would still apply. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that's how we are drafting our rules to fit this talk.
Okay, committee, any questions for state lands? Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So in the end, how much time are we thinking that this expedited period would lessen? I guess, are we saying a month or 2 months? Or, I mean, I kind of wonder if it's worth our time to be doing what we're doing.
Mr. Chairman, like I talked about, we could shorten the public comment process by 30 days, so there's a month that we could shorten it. But it is typical that our appraisal process is the longest part of this whole thing, just like we've recognized today. So if we are starting at a value without going through the appraisal process, that could shorten it by another 2 months to maybe even 4 to 6 months like we're talking about. However, the types of transactions we're contemplating are those relatively simple 40 to 640 acre parcels, which those appraisals don't take much time. So it would likely be a 2 to 4 month shortening of the process.
Hey, committee, any further questions for state lands? Okay, and I'd just like to, I guess, make a comment more than a question. I certainly understand that you're perfectly within, your rulemaking authority to make these changes now. You don't necessarily need legislation. I appreciate that you are pursuing this path now, and obviously the difference is, and the question for the committee is, are we going to guarantee that this process will always be in place by sort of putting it in statute or in a, well, not necessarily guarantee it. Are we going to require that the legislature come back and repeal it if we're going to get rid of this process, or are we going to leave that up to state lands? So that's the difference, and that'd be the difference of whether we pursue legislation or not. Are we going to solidify this process in statute or not? So that's a fundamental question. I agree. It's kind of 6 one way, half a dozen the other. So Representative Winters, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if this is the right place to do this, but my question is, how is this going to affect the land user, livestock people? And I was wondering if it would be appropriate to request the opinions of the livestock people and the Farm Bureau.
Okay. All right, so if there's no further questions for state lands, we can move on to our ag lobby, I guess. They got a question for him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. McGagnon, it looks like you're standing up. You want to come forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagnon with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. And we would urge you not to move forward with this bill as it's currently drafted for a couple of reasons. I would just remind the committee that public use of state trust lands is a privilege that was granted some 30 years ago by the Board of Land Commissioners. It didn't exist prior to that time, and it's the only major use of state lands that is not a revenue source to the State Land Trust. And so while we would be very supportive of efforts by the State Land Office and the encouragement of this committee to expedite the land exchange process, particularly where those exchanges are proposed by current grazing lessee or adjacent landowner, we would not want to see in the statute that the one non-revenue use of state lands is given a higher profile by virtue of a bill like this being passed. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, I appreciate that feedback. As I look at it, I mean, would it help you if this process had to be initiated by the current lessee of those lands? Would that help? And as well as not diminish the value to the state?
Mr. Chairman, I'm a little hesitant because there are various scenarios. There are occasional cases where the current lessee of the land is not necessarily the adjacent private landowner. I think these exchanges work best when they serve the function of consolidating state lands, enabling the state trust to potentially enhance revenue, and at the same time help to consolidate private land ownership as well. So with that in mind, certainly if the State Land Office is looking at some additional rules or regulations, some priority consideration to land exchanges that are proposed by either the grazing lessee or perhaps better stated by the adjacent private landowner would be very welcomed.
Okay, any questions for the Stock Growers Committee?
Thank you, Mr.
Okay, I
Chairman.
appreciate that feedback. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. In looking at these existing items, I think on page 3, lines 10 and 11, better meet the multiple use objectives for the benefit of the trust. I think that's covered. Each exchange or sale is so unique that there's so many different variables that can go into it. I don't know how you would try to put that into statute. I think our current system works fairly well. The concerns that I've had from my members is that the state land is valued quite a bit higher than the private lands, and perhaps there's reasons for it, perhaps there isn't, but that's been the biggest complaint. And hearing from the state lands, if they can already write rules to expedite this, is this just another piece of legislation we don't really need? That's a question for you folks. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd sit for any questions.
Okay, any questions for the Farm Bureau? Okay, thank you, sir. Any further public comment on this draft piece of legislation? Mr. DeCaria.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Ken DeCaria of the Wyoming School Boards Association. And I guess I just need to go back, and I know you get tired of me saying this, but I would just want to separate school trust lands out of this argument because we get back into that discussion again about state lands and people have a different interpretation of what they mean. School trust lands were for one purpose, and that's to generate revenue for the trustees of the state of Wyoming. When you talk about constituents, I hope you remember, and I'm sure you do, that those K-12 students are your constituents too, and so you have to think about those constituents in this discussion as well as other people. Some of this I find a little, disconcerting in some ways, because if this was the other way, if the Office of State Lands was trying to buy somebody's private lands, I bet their land value, there'd be some discussion on the other way too, that what people think their land's worth. Everybody thinks their property is worth much more than somebody else's. If I'm buying it, it's not worth that much. But if it's mine, it's worth a lot. And so that's I guess the difficulty in this process is how do you figure that out? What is a fair value in part of that? And I guess the last point, if you thought about this from some of the legislation that's come up in the last few sessions about access in school trust lands that are landlocked by private sections, there's been trespass and things, ways of making that public access harder, not easier. And I think if you're going to do this, you have to think about it across the board. And so sometimes if you were to put some rule into place, I think you need to think about the unintended consequences. What does that mean for other pieces of property and having that access? And, Mr. Chairman, I know I've said many times, I trust the Office of State Lands. I think they take this trust obligation very, very seriously, and they've demonstrated that time after time after time. And so, Mr. Chairman, I guess I would encourage you and speak against this piece of legislation just because I really don't feel that it's necessary. But, Mr. Chairman, if something were to go forward, I think you always, and I know this committee knows that, but the school trust lands, you have to look at those with that trust obligation and the constitutional obligation of those lands. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, sir. Any questions for the school boards? Okay, I guess I'll ask some that Representative Simpson brought up. Do you think that this has potential to increase the value for school trust lands?
Well, Mr. Chairman, public access, as it stands right now, I guess that that could be a different way, but right now there is no fee for public access on property, and so that's one part. So if it's just for public access, that's very different. Public access, by and large, does increase the value of those parcels if they were going to be used for something else. If you're going to put some type of commercial business on there, for example, yes, that definitely increases the value of those lands. And so, I think all those have to be taken into account. But, Mr. Chairman, remember, this is just the voluntary exchange. If we were talking about, more complicated exchanges, my understanding was this piece of legislation really wouldn't, address those issues. So, Mr. Chairman, I know that was a long way around. Yeah, public access generally does increase value of property.
Okay, any further questions, committee? Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Any further public comment on this draft bill? Okay, going once, going twice, public comment is closed. So, committee, seems like we've got some decent feedback, seems like we've got a lot of things going on with state lands and investments, so I'm interested to see what those rules are. Personally, I think that the bill as it is needs some work if we are going to pursue it, so we could I guess we could take a vote on it now, or we could defer it to our October meeting. So, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I think that I certainly don't want to can this, but I do think that we should continue to work on it and not take a final vote today. I would move to table it or defer it until our October meeting in DuBois.
Okay, moved by Representative Pons, seconded by Senator Steinmetz to defer this draft bill to our October meeting. Any discussion, committee? Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. Okay, that motion carries. All right, so we are wrapping up our state lands and investments topics. Is there any public comment on state lands and investments before we move on to invasive species? Any public comment at all? Any comments from the committee? Okay, all right, thank you, everybody. We'll move on. And all right, only 40 minutes ahead of schedule, so we're doing good. So. Yeah. So moving on to invasive species. We'll get started with this. Maybe we'll take a little break once we kind of get our feet wet on invasive species. So we'll do a budget overview right up front. So.
Doug come up. Is he not here?
Right. Mr. Chairman, Slade Franklin, Weed and Pest Coordinator with the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. I've been asked to give a quick overview of weed and pest budgets. I know we talked a little bit about that in Sheridan when you guys met last time, but I'll kind of review some of that and talk a little more about the actual district budgets, local budgets too, which I don't think we covered very much of in Sheridan. So with that, I'll just give a quick overview and we'll kind of go from there. Kent Drake is with me, who is the Manager for Tech Services with the Department of Ag, and he will cover the actual pesticide registration program. So I'll let him tackle that, and we'll answer questions when we're done. So.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'll first touch, Mr. Chairman, on the actual district budgets and how they work, and specifically, we have 23 weed and pest districts in each county of the state, and all of them are funded by a mill levy program. Statutes provide up to 2 mill levies available for a weed and pest district. Budgets are provided to manage for designated and declared species. Those are the priorities, and that's what the funding needs to be spent on, is specifically designated and declared species. Last time we talked about designated being the state list of species, and then there's also the declared list, which are additional species that county wants to deal with their program. So a lot of times you'll see, for instance, mosquitoes under the county lists, or you'll see some of those species that may be very specific to a county that they want to deal with, where the state lists usually are species that are statewide or state concern. Districts are required to provide or to create their budget using the Department of Revenue's budget form. It's a same form and same process that all special districts utilize. Their budgets are created by the district board, and they hold public hearings on those budgets to allow for any public input. That budget is then approved by that district board, and then the budget is put in front of the county commissioners for final approval. County commissioners do have the ability to line item veto the budget if they feel fit, but typically those two entities work pretty closely on that budget, and they have a public hearing with the county commissioners, so the districts talk about how they set those budgets up. After the budget's approved, they are provided to the county clerk's office and the Department of Audit, so public is able to see that final budget if they would like to see what the district is doing with the funds that are provided. And the budgets, as you can assume, are with each county is going to be there's a lot of variation. We have some districts that have high property valuation and some that have very low, so we do have district budgets that may vary from $1.6 million down to $200,000. So there's quite a variation between the districts in terms of what their funding provides. The funding that they use, a lot of the funding they have does provide cost share for the landowners. If a landowner comes in and has a designated or declared species on their property, they do cost share with the funding provided. They also do applications of herbicides or insecticides as needed for those species, depending on what the board has determined their program will be. One of the components of the statute is if there is a city or town in the county that has 5,000 people or more, they are capable of pulling 85% of the mill levy funds that were collected in that city or town back to that city or town if they have their own weed and pest program. And so those funds will go back, and then they are supposed to run their own weed and pest program. That program is managed by the city. The board has no say in terms of how those funds are utilized, but the cities are requested or required to provide a final report to explain how those funds were used on designated and declared species. That really kind of sums up the first mill. Now the second mill is called the Special Management Program. Special Management Program was created, and it's allowed to be used for a maximum of 2 species. It can be either 2 weeds, 2 pests, or a combination of 1 of each. Leafy spurge has always been the priority under the Special Management Program, because when the program was first created back in the 70s, it was actually called the Leafy Spurge Program, and over time it developed into just a Special Management Program. So you'll see a lot of the districts in the state still have leafy spurge as a priority under that second mill. With that program, it's a little more complicated than the first mill. The districts are required to set up special management zones where they're going to use those funds. They have to create contracts with landowners in terms of how those funds will be used. And then they also have to publish all the landowners in a local newspaper who are participating in the program. And it also requires that the district pays 80% of the total cost of the application or the control program, and the landowner only pays 20%. So there's a heavier financial burden on the district with that program. And right now we have 12 of the 23 districts who are utilizing that second mill. So right around half of them are taking full advantage of their 2 mills. So that kind of sums up just the district budgets. The next part I'm going to go into is really kind of a repeat of what we talked about last time in terms of the Department of Ag budget. So I might...
yeah, we want to pause here. Having questions on the local revenue generation. What's the overall revenue raised throughout the state from these 1 or 2 mills? Okay. Okay. I will maybe just touch on, a couple minutes you say, right? What's that? A couple minutes, and I didn't quite catch what you said there. The mill levies, how much is that, those local mill levies? How much
total generation for the state?
Yeah.
It's around $16 million.
Okay.
So, and that's reported every year in the Department of Revenue's annual report. You can see what each district brings in with their mills, or how many they collect too.
Okay, and just for review, how much overall budget with weed and pest expenditures throughout the state, how much is that, the overall budget with all revenue sources?
That I don't know if I could answer for you. Are you talking statewide?
Right, statewide, all, whether it be local funding or state funding, all, total spending on weed and pest.
At least for weed and pest, I would say the district funding is providing, I'm guessing here, probably 80% of what we're using for weed and pest control.
Okay. Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you have an idea how many cities take that 85% and use it? And do they need to specifically use that on noxious weeds, or is that an overall weed program?
Mr. Chairman, good question. I can't tell you specifically how many there are. I can tell you a couple examples. City of Cheyenne does, City of Sheridan does. The statutes say that they could use those funds for weed and pest control. Doesn't say designated and declared. So it doesn't really require them to use it for the designated and declared species. However, the statutes do require them to provide an annual report on how much of that they do use for designated and declared species. So just as an example, I brought here, the City of Cheyenne every year does provide a report on how they utilize those funds from their county for their program. And you'll see a majority of their funds actually go to the mosquito control program in their city or in their county. So I guess I can get an answer for you on that in terms of how many cities are actually utilizing that, but there are some that do. I just don't know the total amount off the top of my head. So.
Any further questions, committee?
Real quick, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess along those lines, to that point, have you always found that to be an agreeable setup? And that, I mean, has there ever been an instance where they're frivolously spending money, or that's wasteful or not, or anything to that?
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, I think one thing would be, there are some programs that are trying within the cities and towns to meet those requirements. There's some places, personal opinion, I won't throw anyone completely under the bus here, but where I see cities and towns, and I'm a little concerned in terms of where they're utilizing those funds. I've seen some city and towns with parks that are filled with leafy spurge, and I haven't seen any action on it. So, you know, what I would probably say would be maybe a solution to it is we've got to find a better way to communicate, you know, on how those funds are being utilized, at least. We did have one county back in the 80s who actually took this issue to the Wyoming Supreme Court. And the Wyoming Supreme Court is the one that said that that district board doesn't have the authority to tell the city or town how to utilize those funds. So, you know, there's a little bit of a precedence there where we did have some districts who were frustrated, and I get some of those calls, and you know, that I take where, you know, maybe we could be utilizing them better with the city of towns also. But I don't have you know, I won't throw anyone completely under the bus with that answer.
We'll talk later. Okay. Representative Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, could you elaborate a little more in detail on the overall budget? So you indicated that roughly 80% of the revenue and expenses spent on weed and pest come from the mill levy. Mm-hmm. The other 20%, I presume, comes from the state?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I guess what I would I'd say is that 20% is either grants from the state, maybe contracts with federal agencies, or grants through federal agencies. So if that answers your question.
Mr. Chairman, so of the 20% that comes from other sources, how much of that goes back into the districts, or is it spent on bigger statewide projects that you just mentioned?
Mr. Chairman, I would say nearly 100% of that's going directly to the districts, either through the grants that we run, we do specifically to the districts that are specific to on-the-ground weed management or pest management, and same with the federal grants. I mean, we have all our grants that the districts I work with, at least, I'm aware of, we don't even include administration costs in those grants. So we're taking what money we can, whether it's state or federal money, and putting it specifically on the ground. So I don't know if that answers your question correctly or not. But.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any further questions, committee, so far? Okay, please continue.
All right. Mr. Chairman, like I said, this is a little bit of a rehashing of budgets specifically for the Department of Agriculture like we talked about last time. So I'll try to just breeze through this as quickly as I can, and then if you guys got questions, we'll go from there. But one thing I want to make clear, and I brought it up last time also, is all funds that at least go through the Department of Agriculture, we utilize a committee to allocate those funds. It's a committee that's created under statute. It's called the State Allocation Committee. It's has the Department of Ag director on it. It has a Board of Agriculture member on it, and then 3 members from the Weed and Pest Council. Right now, those 3 members include 2 supervisors and 1 board member. So we have a pretty good a group of guys who go over those grants on an annual basis. And so all the funding that we have that comes from the Department of Ag, whether it's federal dollars that are flow through or it's state funding, we'll utilize that committee in a grant process to allocate those every spring. The first set of funds I'll talk about is we do get a contract funds from the Department of Transportation for right-of-way weed control. That amount is $500,000 annually. That is a flow-through program that we administer through the Department of Ag and allocate through the SAC committee. We do an annual allocation to all 23 districts. They utilize that to spray the designated and declared species along the state highways and right-of-ways. Districts do not charge, as I mentioned before, any administrative charges to those funds. It's simply what their labor costs are and herbicide costs are. So again, it's a program that we put directly on the ground. And just comparatively, I think I brought this up too last time, Montana spends what I was told $4.5 million on their right-of-way control, and Colorado spends $2.5 million. And I'd say we've got both those states beat in terms of how we manage our right-of-ways. So, second program that we do administer through the Department of Agriculture is the Special Management Program. Again, talked about the Special Management Program and the statutes and the mill levy associated with that. We have an annual allocation of $320,000. Excuse me, that's a biannual allocation. And $77,000 of that is allocated to the Weed and Pest Council's Biocontrol Consortium. That funding is used to help fund the research into new biocontrol agents that we can utilize, whether it's bugs. The new one that's out there now is a rust that can be used on Canada thistle. And a lot of that research actually does happen overseas, specifically in Switzerland. So it's something that we've kind of are a leader in the state on in terms of trying to find new ways to actually manage these weeds beyond just the herbicides. So with that, then $242,000 or $121 annually is allocated to weed and pest districts, and we use that. The priority with those funds are going to be the special management programs, or actually is required to have a special management program. So typically we see those funds go to counties that have a leafy spurge program. The next program that we deal with is the Pesticide Registration Fee Grant, which is what we're talking about with your proposed legislation. We have an annual or biannual allocation on that of $773,000. $30,000 of that is allocated annually to the Weed and Pest Council's mapping consortium. We have someone who works with the Fremont County Weed and Pest, who works with all our districts across the state, and helping them implement a mapping and GIS program. So we're all utilizing the same system, and we can kind of draw our information and know it's going to be similar from district to district. So it's been a really good program for all of them.
And just on that, do you imagine those $30,000 expenditure is going to continue, or at some point is that effort going to cease and you'll redivert those funds?
Mr. Chairman, good question. Fremont County has been great about volunteering one of their employees to do this. As long as she's willing to do it and she's still working there, I could see it continuing. But I certainly don't know what the future will hold when she moves on.
And so you describe this as an ongoing effort as invasive species change location, that it's a constant effort, and it's not as if, once you get all the information uploaded in the GIS, you're done. It's going to be a continuous effort.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's certainly, the value in GIS and mapping is not only to map where the weeds are, but to map where you treat, so you can go back, whether it's 5, 10, 15 years, and actually see what the difference is and what the treatments. One of the things that, when I took this job over in 2004, I ran into a lot of maps that were taken back in 1950s of various weed infestations in the state. And she has tried to even incorporate that information in there so we can see kind of a prolonged, story in terms of what invasive species are doing in our state.
Okay, thank you. Please continue.
Yeah. And then with that, just with those funds, one thing that we do utilize or do try to do with the SAC committee is we try to prioritize where those fundings go based on the needs for the districts. I mentioned there is a disparity between district fundings and mill levies, so we put a lot of priority on those counties that don't collect the mill levy amounts as some of the others. However, there is emphasis also on EDRR projects, where if a new species was to show up in our state or in a region in the state, we could take those funds and really prioritize them to that. So, you know, districts like Weston County and Hot Springs County, Niobrara County, where they don't really draw enough funds to do the treatments that they need, that's where those grants have really helped in the past. So, and I would just kind of add with that too, in 2018, we did fund $371,000 of those grant funds, and we matched, the districts matched it, and the landowners in those areas matched it with $671,000. So it does generate local dollars too in terms of getting the work done. And then we did treat somewhere around 7,200 acres last year with those funds too. So that's mainly the three programs that we deal with the Department of Ag that have funding. Now there are some special grant programs. 2 years ago we did get a $1 million grant through the Forest Service for sage grouse related invasive species projects. Those funds have been allocated out to some larger landscape scale projects, and they're ongoing as we speak. And then, of course, the districts work with State Lands Office in terms of weed control on state lands, and there's funds within the state lands budget for that. And then federal funds, we do get a flow-through program from the Forest Service called State and Private Forestry. That typically is around $90,000 that annually we put out to weed projects on state and private land, but it has to be neighboring Forest Service land, so we can try to coordinate those programs with Forest Service and what they're doing for weed control. So that's a program that's a 50-50 match, and it does have a requirement of 10% tree canopy in the area in terms of where those funds are used. So a little bit of a top of the world view of some of the funding programs out there.
Okay, I appreciate the review again, and with some more detail as far as the local funding, which obviously is a huge part of the picture as well. So any questions on weed and pest funding overall in the state? I think we just got a pretty comprehensive overview. So. Okay, well, if there's no further questions, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break then. We'll only be a few minutes ahead of schedule then. Give members of the public, if they want to comment, it's an opportunity to show up if they haven't already. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started about 5 till with the registration fee overview. So. So you're folks at this one, right?
What that I'm doing when
No, those were, I, yeah, those were, anyway, yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here, ladies and gentlemen. I guess we'll go ahead and, we kind of already talked about the pesticide registration fee. We'll go ahead and do that next, and then we'll open kind of this overview up to public comment before we get into the draft bill. So, Mr. Franklin, by all means, continue. Or whoever wants to speak, I guess.
Mr. Chairman, Kent Drake, Division Manager for the Technical Services Division. In our division, we do many things, including pesticides. We do registration of pesticides, feeds, fertilizers, animal remedies, seed, and within that, the pesticide registration is by far the largest amount. The fees generate over $3 million for the state. Right now, the pesticide registration is about 2.2 million. But we'll get into some specifics of that. I'm sorry I missed the last meeting, so Slade will help me as we go along here to make sure that your questions that you had are answered. Back when this legislation first started in '06, the first year of registration, there was roughly 14,000 pesticide products. Now, pesticide products is more than just Roundup or insecticide or what you might use around your house, but you probably use some things that are actually pesticides that you didn't realize. If you have mosquitoes and you've had a backyard party and Centronella candles are registered in Wyoming as a pesticide. If you've been up in the mountains with the bears and you've had bear spray is registered in Wyoming as a pesticide. And antibacterial soap in our hospitals or just in your own home, anything that kills germs is considered a pesticide, so that's registered. So all of those things encompass pesticides in Wyoming. Currently, we have approximately 12,725 registered pesticides compared to in 2006 when we had 14,000. We're fairly close to that number of 12,725. Within Wyoming, those that are registered that are actually from Wyoming companies, we sorted out 38 of those. And predominantly, 23 of those rely with YTech and Casper as the largest in-state registrant of pesticides in Wyoming with 23 registrations. We'll go ahead and we've got a copy of comparison of state pesticide registrations from all over the United States. Don't know if everybody has a copy, but I'll ask Slade to pass that out. Currently, when the legislation started in 2006, we were at $75, and that registration fee has stayed the same until a few years ago when we started the pesticide training program and certification program, and that added another $15. So we are currently at $90 per registered product in Wyoming. Give you a moment to look that over, comparison to other states. So with that, we've got another handout, Slade, to go ahead. There was some discussion at the last meeting that you'd like a breakdown of some possible scenarios or at least some historical data of where we've been through pesticide registration over the years. That one's coming out now and we'll, again, it's estimates. These aren't exact figures, but we try to keep it as close as we can. And we're trying to compare the registrations we have today, excluding those that are Wyoming registrants. And so we had a number of a little over 12,700 as far as our products being registered. If we look back in 2006, the income off of that at $75, which is Formula 2, the second one down there. If you look at 2006, Formula 2, at $75, that generates a little over $1.9 million. And as we started back in 2006, the budget then was $1.25 million for pesticide registration grants, those grants that Slade talked about that came from this funding. So at that rate, then that left a balance in the general fund of $656,000 that stayed in the general fund. Currently, if you go up to Formula 1, currently, those 12,709 products generate $90 each. So that's almost $2.3 million. 400,000 of that is the $15 that was enacted a few years ago for the certification and training program. That's in our budget. And then, as you know, over time, the pesticide grant funding was cut. Currently, there's $773,671 in there. And so then these fees generate a surplus to the state general fund of $1.11 million is where we are currently. Slade created a couple of formulas, the numbers 3 and 4 there, basically looking at one, if you increase the amount of funding or the amount of registration per product up to $120, 12,709 products at $120 would generate a little over $3 million. Again, we have the $400,000 for the training and certification program, and then if you increased the pesticide registration grants up to where they were previously to 1.536 to 11, a little over $1.5 million, that still generates that excess into the state's general fund. And then finally, Formula 4 there just talks about maybe a break even if you're looking at continuing the surplus into the general fund, having the grants at $1.25 million where they were when the funding started, and then also the $400,000 into the pesticide applicator certification program and training. That is roughly $109 per product as a break even.
Okay, committee, any questions for that overview or any of those handouts? Okay, so just so I understand, when it comes to that balance between how much gets put towards the grants and how much gets put towards the general fund, that's determined through the appropriations process, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so all that we'd be doing is increasing the pot of money, I guess. Ultimately, we'd have to look at the budget bill to ensure that a certain amount gets put towards the actual grant program, and whoever else is put towards general funds or potentially retained within the Department of Agriculture to take some programs off of general funds, whatever we end up doing through the appropriations process. So we're only doing basically one half of the process, basically. Is that correct with this piece of legislation?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Okay, committee, any questions right now on pesticide registration fees? Okay, well, I have a question about that relatively new program at UW. What's been the feedback on that? I know it was instituted within the past couple of years. he just spent a little bit more time talking about that program and what the value is to the state.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, we'll do that. The program itself goes to the University of Wyoming and through their Cooperative Extension Service, helps fund a couple of positions and materials and some things over at the research station in Torrington. And those folks there work very closely within our division. We have one coordinator that is in charge of pesticide education and licensing, and it's been real valuable to work with them because they've generated new materials, created new programs to help education, which we find is very important because EPA, FIFRA back in 1973 started with education, certification and training required for pesticide applicators. Well, now that's going nationwide where that is being all reevaluated by each state's plan. And so it's been really good to work with them and help develop this plan so they have the training module, we have the certification side of it and licensing, and from that standpoint it's worked really well as we move forward and get closer to having to have our C&T plan through EPA certified. They also have been within budget. There hasn't been an issue with that. It's a little less than the $400,000 appropriation, but it's clearly within its lines of the budget.
Hey, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So maybe you can help me out here. Did the feds used to put some money into the education program, and that is taken away, and now the states are needing to pick that up?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a real good answer. I know in my past life I worked for Cooperative Extension through the University of Wyoming, and typically they had a major role in education, and I believe there was some federal funding for that at that level. And we receive a grant through EPA that helps with our certification and licensing program. So we still get some money through EPA. It's on a grant basis, but it's just not for certification and training.
Okay. Any further questions, committee? All right. Well, thanks. Appreciate it for the good information, and we'll see what comes of it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any public comment before we get to the draft bill? Any public comment on this general topic? Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Keith Kennedy on behalf of the Wyoming Ag Business Association. First, to go back to that last question, over the past 15 years, essentially all of that money that Wyoming has dedicated to certification and training formerly came from EPA. Perhaps not quite that amount, but very close to it 15 years ago. And over the years, that money has slowly decreased. While there still is money that is provided to the Department of Ag, it's quite a bit less than it had been 15 years ago, and it has just been a ratcheting down over the years. While I have not seen the map that lays out what the fees are in each state, a couple of things that I think you ought to bear in mind, and our position with the Ag Business Association has been that these monies shouldn't benefit specific registrants over other registrants. Hence our support of the certification and training that was done previously. And we had also, since the last meeting, discussed other uses, programs that could use support within the Department of Ag and or the University of Wyoming. One is the Cooperative Annual Pest Survey. And in particular, many states in conjunction with that program, monitor bee health, which is one of the main focus issues for most pesticides these days. Another issue is groundwater and surface water monitoring, which the Department of Ag cooperates with U.S. Geological Survey on an annual survey, and you may have seen that report. If not, please let me or the Department of Ag know, and we'd be happy to get that to you. The other thing that I would point out on these fees is that if you look at all of our surrounding states and almost all other states, we are the only one who assesses sales tax on these pesticides to agricultural producers. And so when you look at the amount that a given producer is paying that goes into the state coffers, overall it's likely the same or higher than most of the other surrounding states because of that sales tax. And I know now's probably not the time to ask for an additional exemption, but that is something that is used in the process of producing another item. Fertilizers and seeds have been exempted for many years because those are inputs used to produce a product, as are these pesticides for agriculture producers. And with that, I would welcome any questions you might have.
Okay, I have one right off the bat. You're talking about the using these fees for other uses. To what extent does the fact that so much of this is going towards general funds now alleviate those concerns? I know it's not the specific programs you want, but they are supporting the state as a whole. Does that alleviate some of your concerns?
Mr. Chairman, it does to a certain extent, and we certainly aren't in favor of instituting fee-based programs, for lack of a better way to put it, where we much appreciate that much of the Department of Ag's budget is funded through the general fund, and I and the Ag Business Association certainly don't want to see us going to an entirely fee-based program. We only need to look to the south to our neighbor to see what the registration fees are for applicators there, where the rate for the commercial applicator is more than 10 times higher than it is in Wyoming.
Okay, any further questions? Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Do you know how many times they do have certification schools? Is it once a year? Mine went lapse, and now I'm having troubles getting to a program, and I think that's pretty darn important to our farmers and ranchers, and the commercial business, obviously.
Mr. Chairman, as I understand it currently, there is an annual certification training held in conjunction with the recertification, generally held in the third week of January, which might make it understandable why it's difficult for you, and I occasionally make 3 trips between Cheyenne and Casper during that week. But the program at UW has also been developing online modules, and as I understand it, whether you're a commercial or a private applicator, and I certainly could be corrected on this, but I believe you can take the test at any county extension office now, rather than having to take it in a specific place. And I did fail to mention one other thing, is as you look at this, the latest estimates that we've received, and granted they're from 2016, from our 2 primary industry groups that represent pesticide registrants, is that Wyoming's share of the national pesticide market is 0.03%. So that's also something that I think you should bear in mind as far as your price point on registration fees as well.
Any further questions, committee? Okay, thank you, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, come on up. See some red badges back there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Luke Sander with I'm the supervisor of Sheridan County Weed and Pest. I would imagine as this process goes through and however it works out, you'll see a lot of us in the Weed and Pest down here supporting the pesticide registration fee increase. And I just kind of want to make sure that everybody knows for sure that the Weed and Pest does not directly benefit from this increase. This directly goes to the landowners. You know, we're here representing the landowners, especially in my county that we have Medusa Head and Ventonata that you probably have heard about. It's very expensive to treat, and it's one of the greatest threats to Wyoming as far as an invasive species. And so we're trying to get a handle on that the best we can. But I hear from landowners every day that they can't completely absorb the cost of treatments. And currently right now, it's about 5% of the suitable habitat within Wyoming. We did find a little bit within Campbell County, but so far it's still cornered up in our part of the state. Also, speaking of increasing the registration fees, realistically, that would almost be doubled because we use a lot of these state fees to match federal dollars. And there's a lot of federal dollars available right now for grants that I use. Just this year alone, and just in Sheridan County, it's been $450,000 in grant money. So this fee would really help a lot because we have a lack of state funds to match federal funds right now. I've dealt with some of the largest companies that register products here. Corteva, which is a merge between Dow and DuPont, Bayer, and then also another one, Van Diest, and they all support the increase, and I'm working on getting letters of support of that increase because they know it's beneficial and they will get that money back easily. 1 gallon of the stuff that we use to treat Medusa Head and Ventonata costs $1,200 a gallon right now, so it's $30 increase is kind of a drop in the bucket for some of that, but what else did I have? Then SAC committee. SAC committee, I think, is one of the most efficient ways to get this money directly to the ground, too. So that's, I guess, all I have. Any questions for me?
Overhead when it comes to administrative costs, and appreciate what you do each and every day up in Sheridan County. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further public comment, just in general, on weed and pest budgets and pesticide registration?
Mr. Chairman, Bob Baumgartner, Goshen County Weed and Pest Supervisor. I would just like to definitely speak to the pesticide registration fee grants in general. Again, as Luke mentioned, they go directly to the producers, to the landowners. They come through us as well. But basically, I mean, along with helping Luke treat Ventonata and Medusa Head, we have had in Goshen County, we've basically been able to not completely eliminate, but completely reduce the Russian olive population along the North Platte River system, going through Goshen County, along with the tributaries, along Bear Creek, Rawhide. We did major work with Russian olive. Currently, we have grant programs that we're running for Dalmatian toadflax. As all of you in Laramie County, Platte County, and surrounding areas know that Dalmatian toadflax is a major issue. We're able to help these landowners with funding to at least give them 50% so that we can get some work done on the ground. And we also run a large prairie dog program. As you all are aware, prairie dogs are a major issue as well. So I definitely want to speak towards this grant, towards the pesticide registration fees. And if we increase them, it's definitely going to help a lot more people. This grant program is, again, administered through SAC, but it is a grant program, so it is, I mean, you have to apply and they have to basically determine if that is where that money should go. So if there's any questions.
Okay. Any questions, committee? Okay, maybe could you describe the effect that the recent cuts have had on weed and pest to this grant program? Can you describe the effects in Goshen County?
I can basically, I guess what I can speak to is going through the grant process. There's been years, I mean, we all apply for X amount that we feel would do us justice. We've been cut. We've also cut ourselves to help out neighboring communities, because I, for one, know as a one of the lower funded counties, this grant and the additional money really helps us and the individuals. So if we can definitely get that that fee base increased, it's not only going to help us, but it's going to help out other individuals as well.
Any further questions, committee? Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any further public comment just in general? Okay, well, we're kind of already talking about it. I guess we'll move on to the draft bill we have before us. So, Mr. Anderson, you want to give us a quick overview, though I imagine it'll be very to the point.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, yeah, like you said, very straightforward. Existing fee is $90 total. This would take it up to $120. You can see down below then $105 of that would be deposited into the special natural resource account, and then $15 would remain going to the pesticide education account. And other than that, very straightforward.
Okay, just to verify that the account reference in the statute is that the account from which Weed and Pest administers those grants that we were talking about, just make sure we're all.
Yeah, I believe so, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that's it's the same existing account, just increases that amount that goes into that from $75 to $105.
And so technically the last time we raised this particular fee was 1993. I understand there's been a fee increase to $15 for a separate purpose, related but separate purpose, but technically it's been since 1993 that we raised this fee. Is that correct?
I believe that's true. So the increase from, it was from 75 to 90, that was in 2016, but then all of that increase was the $15 that went into that education account.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, committee, any questions for our staff? Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, so any further comment we have on this particular bill? I guess we've kind of touched a lot of the issues surrounding it. Do we have any further comment on the bill before us? This is 20 LSO-17 or 147, working draft .4. Okay, all right. Well, I guess we've already had a lot of testimony on it. So with that, committee, I guess we'll have public comment going once, going twice. We'll go ahead and close that. Committee, we have a draft bill before us. What's your pleasure? Okay. Okay. So Senator Cost moves to sponsor it as a committee bill. Seconded by Senator or Representative Tass. You're second. Okay. All right. Okay, so any discussion, committee? Like I said, just, okay, all right, well, that makes it easy. And we got a few proxy votes, so maybe we can call those out as their names come up. We'll go ahead and call the roll.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, so this is for Bill Draft 20 LSO 147. Senator Bouchard. No. Senator Cost. Aye. Senator Moniz left the proxy vote of aye. Senator Steinmetz. Aye. Representative Blake left the proxy vote of aye. Representative Clausen. Aye. Representative Haley left the proxy vote of aye. Representative Henderson excused. Representative Larson. Aye. Representative Simpson. Aye. Representative Tass. Aye. Representative Winter. Aye. Co-Chairman Hunt.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Boner.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, that passed both houses.
Okay, very good. So, Representative Hunt, you have something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would wonder if this would be the appropriate time for Representative Larson to briefly explain his bill and his proposal that he had brought a couple of sessions ago concerning weed and pest issues.
Yeah, absolutely would.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman and Chairman. I brought this bill in 2017. I didn't get very far at all. I don't even know if I brought it forward, can't remember. Doesn't look like it. Mainly this was dealing with the weed and pest and the noxious weeds that might be on some private property, and their ability to try to control that. The big issue is you may have a property owner that doesn't want anybody out there, obviously, snooping around or spraying, but it does affect many of the neighbors, and it could affect quite a few. For an example, we had some noxious weed up on North Fork above Buffalo Bill Reservoir, and we were having troubles getting there to control it, and that would have spread to like 4 irrigation districts after it got into the reservoir. And so you got 100,000 acres that are, we're supplying seed to. So that was one of the big reasons for bringing this up in our area. It is a big worry that your private property rights and such, but when it affects so many. The main reason for this would be the timing issue. Right now, you have to go through, like on subsection A of 115109. It says here, we're crossing it out right now on line 13. You have to go through the use of lawful entry procedures. And so then you have to go through your county attorney to try to get him to press the issue. And a lot of times you're beyond the spraying time and the seeds are already out there. So that was the main reason on A, was to make this procedure quicker. And I think that's probably the main part where we crossed out that. On B, it talks about the district board, that'd be the Weed and Pest District Board, and this is current law already. 2/3 of the members have to agree that they'll send a letter to the landowner. But in this part, we're adding, in this letter, it'll also say includes control procedures, cost schedules, and deadlines by which stages of control shall be completed. And so we're giving them an idea, the landowner, of how quick they need to get this done. And then after that, they send this letter out, and I think they have a certain amount of time to the landowner to call back and say, come and do it. And if they refuse in here, then they can go to the Attorney General, and in the bill it actually tells, or not the Attorney General, the county attorney, it actually says the county attorney will proceed with his duties within 15 days on page 4. So I think the whole idea is to try to get these landowners to cooperate. Another item down on page 4 that is a big concern, I'm sure, it states the landowner who fails to cooperate in remediating or allow remediation of any area infested with weeds or pests is liable to other property owners for the cost of remediation of the infestation of weeds and pests. So that's a big thing to be putting in there, but these neighbors need a way to keep their land healthy. So that's the main premise to the bill. I would ask that my weed and pest director would be able to have time to comment, hopefully here in a bit.
Sure. Yeah.
He was kind of the main reason I brought it.
Okay, so before we get to that committee, any questions for Representative Larson? Representative Hunt?
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that I'm wondering, and this is actually, I guess, is in current statute, but on page 2, line 16, where it says, notice is deemed to have been given if it is deposited in the post office by a certified mail with sufficient postage, et cetera, at least 5 days before entry. And my concern, certainly not to throw a wrench into this proposal, but and Senator Steinmetz may want to chime in on this, is that you've got an issue with absent landowners. And I guess what I'm thinking of is this is a little bit similar to the issue we had a few years ago with land inspection fees, and that was more pertaining to the post office and their failure to notify the recipient that their address had been changed per the post office's standards. But what I'm getting at is that, is this language as is currently written in statute sufficient to provide proper notice? So if we don't exactly know where the landowner is, as at least at that moment, that are we giving them proper notification, or is there sufficient protocol of notification so that they're not sincerely blindsided by this process, and that they are unaware of the problem that may be there? So I'm throwing that out there for additional discussion.
No, Senator Simons?
So I think we should defer to Weed and Pest to let us know how they do that.
I don't think your microphone is on. It's flashing. That's no good. Yeah, looks like it's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the use of your microphone. So I think we'll defer to Weed and Pest to visit about how they notify now, and if they feel that that would need tweaked or not. There might need to be more tweaking of this bill should we choose to proceed with this subject. But I would like to state for the record that this is a real issue in our county as well, where we're mostly private property. We have a lot of absentee landowners that are not taking care of their noxious weeds or their predators. We have some real prairie dog and thistle problems that are not being taken care of. And because so many times a parcel is subleased for more than one leasee, then we have a problem with communication there as well. So we probably need to address that. However, they're damaging the property owners around them. So property rights work two ways. They're not just we have to talk about who we're affecting as well. And so I think this is a really important discussion for this committee to have. I don't know where it will go, but I really appreciate your time and attention to the matter. Thank you.
Okay, well, I have a question. Maybe it's a little glib, because does this apply to the federal government as well? If they're not controlling, say, prairie dogs or something like that? Okay, so you don't have to answer that. That's fine. Representative Clausen, you have.
Mr. Chairman, that was just kind of what I wanted to comment about. So I can see this being a valuable tool in the farm country, but where there's mixed ownership with our federal partners, specifically, maybe some of these agencies are managing forests and things that are considered as pests. This could create a real nightmare for some of those people in our part of the world that are dealing with those federal lands issues, that the federal agencies managing for a pest, and then they would in turn be essentially penalized because of what the federal government's pushing on them too.
Representative.
Mr. Chairman, I really don't know how to answer that.
Okay. Your mic's not working either.
It's working in office or not? Is that supposed to go here?
No, your microphone is not working. Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
All of these mics are over there.
Okay.
Wow. Is it working there?
No. Okay, so.
There it is.
Oh, wow. There we go.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. Also in this discussion, Mr. Chairman, if I can go forward, we may want to talk about the issue of other states, and I think prior law in the state of Wyoming actually had it where when you got to the point that the weed and pest district would go and control the weeds, that it could be put on their tax assessment if they did not pay that. you know, the fee to get it sprayed. You know, we need to discuss that at some point too, I hope.
Senator Cost.
Mine's blinking.
There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
I also agree, I think we got to be careful with the pests because of the complications that could go into that. But the other thing is, I would like to see a better definition or a definition of infested so that one county or one group are not taking it one way and somebody else some other way. Do we have something that would be consistent statewide would be my concern.
Okay. Okay, for Representative Simpson. Okay, yeah, hold down the button until it, there you go.
I think you probably got too many mics on.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, just a few days ago I received a call from one of my constituents complaining about this situation. The neighbors were delinquent and not taking care of business, and she got me a little off guard and I wasn't prepared to address this, but in her comment she made the comment that the local weed and pest director had told her that there is regulations on the books, but the state has decided not to enforce them. So I can't wait to go home to clarify that with her. I see some value in your draft legislation here, and I really like the back half of the changes, but on page 2, the idea that we're going to preempt use of lawful entry procedures really has me troubled. I know that shortens the time frame up, but the concept that we're placing noxious weeds over a person's right to have his land private, to the point that we're abandoning lawful entry procedures has me concerned. I could not support this if we keep that line 9 in there, but I would support the rest of the improvements in this proposed legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. That is a big concern. I think as we get testimony from the weed and pest, we'll probably hear their side of the story. A lot of times it's the I believe it's the county attorney that is kind of not taking the steps they need to in a expedient manner. Expeditious, there we go. So that is something we definitely need to discuss, and maybe we can come up with some different wording or something. I also have a desk mate sitting here saying on line 4, maybe we need to reword some at the very end describing such probable cause. Maybe we were thinking maybe an actual evidence of it being there or something, you know. But this is pretty important. I hope we'll get the weed and pest to tell us their concerns.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I really sympathize with some of this. I have a neighbor upstream who doesn't treat his leafy spurge. But I really worry about it. We've talked about the invasive species of the grasses that are coming in up there in Sheridan County being horribly, horribly expensive. I am uncomfortable passing legislation or even with the old existing law that you could come in on a person's property and assess him more than the value of the land to control the weeds and put him in a horrible spot. I don't know. I really disagree with the government having that much power to come in on private property. If they come in and pay for treating it, that might be one thing, but to come in and say that you have to pay to treat on your property for a species that is going to cost you more than the value of your land or what it'll ever produce, I'm real uncomfortable with that.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll pivot to our weed and pest professionals, if you want to make some comment on this particular bill, or just overall concept, whatever you think.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Josh Shorb. I'm the supervisor for Park County Weed and Pest up in Powell, and I wrote a few notes here. I'm going to try to address some of the things that have been out discussed right now. When I visited with Representative Larson a handful of years ago, the specific issue that we were dealing with was West Dakota with leafy spurge. We're lucky in that part of the world. We don't have as much leafy spurge as other areas of the state, and that's a big priority to us. Park County Weed and Pest, we spend a lot of our own money. We treat it 100% for those people. A lot of the people in there, they do their own treatments. There's residents in that area of the world that do not like pesticides or chemicals at all, and they realize the greater importance of the issue of getting that plant under control so it doesn't spread, and we end up looking like other areas of the western U.S. And this one particular situation, one landowner was in the middle of it and he didn't want to participate, and it spread all over that valley. It keeps on doing so, and it is above, like Representative Larson mentioned, is above 4 irrigation districts, and it goes into Buffalo Bill Reservoir, and then that water is distributed out to there over, I don't even know, a lot of ground. So that's where that issue was. We tried to talk to him over the years. And somebody brought up, what do we do first? And the first thing we do is we try to go knock on the guy's door and talk to him. And, we talk about our different cost share programs, and we're here to do this, and this is what we want to do. We never approach it, we're the government, and here's a big stick, and this is what we want to do. We just want to get the plant under control. After all those years, when I'm talking about over a decade, just trying to be reasonable. Here's some free chemical. We'll come do it ourselves. We'll, whatever. I mean, it was a long process, and finally, our board of directors decided to go down the process of going to court, and then he finally said, okay, we can do something. But it was over a decade, and that's just when I showed up. In the year 2000, I think it was going on a long time before that as well. So that's the first thing that we do. We try to go talk to the guy. We don't like to go down through that. We don't like to go through that process. Being this is, July and August, one of the biggest complaints that we get, at least into my office, is when all the thistles are flowered out and blowing, and we get a lot of complaints from landowners saying, I'm doing all this effort on my land, I'm spending all this money, and my upwind landowner or neighbor is not doing anything. And you probably all seen this, and things blowing across. The neighbor has prairie dogs, and they're coming across the fence. Issues like the federal government has prairie dogs, that's been a big issue in this, and I know that's reached the levels of our congressional delegation and how all that has played out. It's a big issue, and we tell them essentially our hands are tied. We can't do much about it. We go talk to them. We can write letters and talk to them about our different cost share programs. But in terms of actually doing something, that doesn't exist in statute. I think, decades ago that did exist. Other states right now do have that authority to go in, and I think if a landowner has, one stem of Canada thistle out there, the county's not going to go after him. One of the concerns that you raised was Ventonada and Medusa Head in Sheridan County. If somebody showed up in, a different county and he has a bunch of Medusa Head and it's at the head of a watershed and he says, I don't want to do anything about it, and then that stuff is going to go, those seeds are free to go across public and private land. And you don't have the choice of whether you're going to accept those or not. You're going to accept them because they're going to blow all over your land, get into your water, spread to your livestock, and they're going to carry it back for you, or whatever the case is going to be. So that's one of the concerns. What are the answers? I'm not sure. One of the gentleman over here brought up, taking out to the language of lawful entry procedures. One problem that the weed and pest districts have struggled with over the years is we don't know the definition of lawful entry procedures. Does that mean going to the county attorney? Does it mean going to the sheriff's office? Does that mean going to, I don't know, but I think that language could be at least defined a little bit further so the districts know exactly what that means, or the county attorney, what that means. If we, see a big problem from a, public road or whatever, an adjacent landowner, and we can see the issue over there, I think the intent of how this is laid out right now is the Weed and Pest can go over there and take some pictures, snip a plant, do all that kind of stuff to provide that evidence for the judge. But right now, how do we do that? Because as a Weed and Pest supervisor, I don't want to meet a guy on the other end of that fence that does not want me there. So we'd like to have that defined a little bit more. But this is a big problem out in the state, especially landowners that don't want to do anything or government agencies that don't want to do anything. And I would stand for any more questions that I forgot.
Okay, any questions, committee, for Weed and Pest from Park County? Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as this current statute goes, how do you notify, what's the process by which you notify landowners that they have a problem? And could you go into a little bit more detail, at least as far as concerns mailing them notifications?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, thank you for that question. What we do is, and I have been writing letters to landowners this summer. In fact, I just wrote a few the other day. We use the most current address on the Park County or the county assessor's website. So, or we could go over to their and to their office, but that's the address that we use. Like I said, a lot of guys, we can go up and knock on his door and have a civil, conversation, and it's taken care of. We send certified letters, and we have some issues, and I finally got a hold of the issue. We were sending it to Half Moon Bay, California, and we've sent a lot of those letters out over the years to this and get no response. But that's where we get our addresses from is the latest tax roll.
Any further questions, committee?
Yes, I have.
Go ahead, Representative Tass.
Thank you, Chairman. Do you have, and I've heard that some of the weed and pest districts have had a problem with the state being willing to pay for the cost share, the state's cost share on state lands, on larkspur or leafy spurge and such. Have you had that kind of problem, and is the state reluctant to pay their cost share on controlling some of the weeds that we already have?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Tass, yeah, there are issues, and there has been some friction between different weed and pest districts and the Office of State Lands on how they run their weed and pest program. Right now, for designated noxious weeds and pests, the state will pay for 100% of the chemical being used. And it's up to the leasee to pay for all the labor, whether he wants to hire the weed and pest, a private contractor, do the work himself. But that entire cost is being borne by that leasee. One of the issues that's been brought up over the years is a lot of state lands, they have public access, and there's a lot of people going out there using that for hunting or fishing, or there's oil and gas interests or something like that, but that cost is borne back to that leasee. There's some other issues. They pay for the treatment, but not necessarily the inventory or their survey, and that's one of the problems out there. We don't know where all the noxious weed or pests lie on state lands, and the state lands not all the time has the locations of that. So how do we know where to go or where to treat? And there's some other issues, and I'm probably not the most qualified guy because I don't have as many state lands in my county as some of the other guys do. But yes, there are certainly there's some friction out there for sure. And
any further questions, committee? Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about page 3, line or subsection E, about fines and such? Do you do that very often, if ever? And does the county attorney help you in a timely manner?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, thank you for that question. Weed and pest districts are not allowed to levy the fines. So I know there are some other states they can go and, you have a weed problem and whatever the situation may be, they can hand you a fine, say, $1,000 or whatever it is. In Wyoming, you cannot do that. The statutes allow a judge, if it gets to that point, he can fine a landowner $50 per day up to a maximum of $2,500 per year, and that's all he can do. County attorneys and weed and pest districts across the state vary a little bit. Some county attorneys, they do represent or do some of this work on behalf of the weed and pest, and some don't. In my example, we have a private attorney do it. Our county attorney said, we're not going to have that relationship, which is fine. So we went along with that process with a private attorney. But if it would have got before a judge, I don't know what he would have done, but we are not allowed to do that. I don't know. I'm not sure. Did that answer your question?
Any further questions, committee? Senator Simons, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you tell us how far a $2,500 fine would go toward, and where the money goes to from that fine, and if it would be cheaper to pay the fine or to take care of the problem? Could you address that? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, thank you. It kind of depends on the $2,500, how far could that go to control an infestation? That would vary really widely depending on the cost of the pesticide, what type of application method would be used. Would the country be rough enough that we have to use backpack sprayers, or could we use ATV sprayers, or could we use aerial equipment like helicopters or planes? So that could vary widely. But $2,500, I think if it's to the point that a weed and pest district has a problem that it has to go to court, I think $2,500 would not come close to addressing the problem, because it's pretty serious, either in terms of acreage or something, an invasive species that we do not have very much of at all in this state. And so we'd have to look around to do that. And so to kind of the second part of that question, it would be, in a lot of cases, it'd be much cheaper for the landowner just to take the fine and not address the problem. Say $2,500, that's the cost of doing business, here you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a follow-up to that is, right now, does that fine go to the school or does it go to you?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, thank you. And I believe it goes to the school fund, if I remember right. I don't know if it's in here or a different section of the statute, but it does not go to the weed and pest.
Any further questions, committee? Okay, well, I have one that, it's going to be an interesting balance to, take care of when there is an issue and balancing that with private property rights. Would it be practical from your perspective if you were only allowed to treat the areas that were at risk for spreading to other people's property? So maybe not the entire property, but only the areas of that private property where there's a risk for it spreading? Or is that just not practical? If you want to go in, you want to take care of the issue?
Mr. Chairman, that certainly could be a happy medium to this issue. This is kind of a sticky issue. If a guy has a big ranch and there's an infestation that's just lying, on the neighbor's border, could you treat that but not the stuff a drainage away or a mile away? I think that could be a happy medium. If it's a small acreage landowner, which in a lot of areas of the state, small acreages are exploding. I know in my area, I own one myself, and that's a hard issue to deal with. So you may want to treat that whole area. So I think it's certainly fraught with gray areas.
Absolutely, but if it's a smaller area, the cost would be lower, and that would be another factor. Would that be correct?
Correct.
Okay. Sounds plausible.
Mr. Chairman, how do you feel about if somehow we could limit this to just tillable acres, so it would damage just damages just to cropland, to kind of narrow the field of where things would end up.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, just to keeping it to tillable acres, I think could present a problem in some areas. Specifically, a lot of ranch lands and rangelands, and maybe what we face up in Sheridan County with the Medusa Head and Ventonata, if there was another different invasive species that came in that we don't have, that was more of a pasture rangeland forest situation, or prairie dogs, or something like, or grasshoppers, something like that, along those lines.
Okay, any further questions, committee? Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much for your time.
Any further public comment on this overall topic here?
Chairman, Bob Baumgartner, Goshen County Weed and Pest. This is getting to be an interesting topic in Goshen County. As Senator Steinmetz commented, Goshen County is a lot of private land. And in the valley and areas, it's a lot of small parcels or smaller parcels of private land. I've got one instance going on right now, basically where we're looking at 2 sections of almost solid prairie dogs on private land. And basically, we're in the process of working through the current weed and pest law. And it is interesting. And again, a lot of individuals don't necessarily know how it works, so we're just kind of feeling our way through. But again, one of the interesting facts, I guess, is there isn't a lot that we can do unless, like it's written in there, if there is probable cause. We actually received a letter from an individual's attorney so that we had probable cause that they felt, which would instigate us to start working on the current weed and pest law. So like I mentioned, we're working through that one right now, but there is, you know, the way it is currently written, it's worked so much through the board. The board is appointed by the county commissioners. So, you know, basically we have to, by resolution of 2/3, they have to agree that this is a problem. So, I mean, if you know, it's landowners on that board that have to agree if it is a problem. And then from that point, then they have to come up, we have to come up with remedial actions. The board has to do that. And I will tell you, there is board members on that board that are looking from both perspectives. They're saying, yeah, if it was me, I probably could not afford to treat that 2 sections of dogs. But then you've also got the individuals that have clean property and are surrounded by weeds and pests, and they want that whole 2 sections treated. So, you know, that's why we have a board. That's why we have to agree upon it. But again, there's definite issues as far as the lawful entry. We've got one issue in Goshen County where you basically, we're dealing with an absentee landowner and you cannot get a hold of that individual. But according to the lawyer in the letter that he wrote to us, you have to go off of the address on those tax rolls, and you basically send them the certified letter to that address. And within 5 days, I guess whether they received it or not, that's the way it works. So there's definitely issues, but we need to get this figured out. The other problem that we are dealing with is the fact of where that money goes. That $2,500, if they are fined, it does absolutely nothing for the pest problem. It does absolutely nothing to get the work done. Now the lawyer, he's in hopes and in anticipation that by us working through the weed and pest law and starting to go through the process, that individual is going to look at it and basically say that, yeah, we got to get something going. But there's also that fact that if they don't want to go through the remedial actions, then there's that ability for the contested hearing. And depending upon where it goes, then it goes into a full-fledged situation in the courts. So it's not a good scenario either way. But on small private lands, we need an ability to take care of some of these problems.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Baumgartner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, on the issue of the mailing and notification, do you feel that, regardless of simply the refusal to cooperate or the refusal to get back in contact with you, do you think that the current language is helpful or adequate? I think that personally the 5-day period is pretty tight, regardless. But do you think that, here's my question. Have you had trouble in the past getting a hold of people or being sure that that address that is currently listed is the actual place that they can be found at?
I personally don't feel that 5 days is probably adequate. Dealing with the United States Postal Service on this case right now, from Torrington, Wyoming, to get to Torrington, Wyoming, it took over 10 days. To get from Torrington, Wyoming to Yoder by going to Cheyenne or wherever and back, it took over 11 days. So 5 days is definitely not adequate. But then again, for me to send a certified letter from Torrington to get to a lawyer in Wheatland, it took 3 days. So it's all in where that letter gets stopped in the postal bag. But yeah, I don't feel 5 days is adequate. But there has to be language in there as far as address, as far as that's stated, because there's no way to find the correct address unless it's on that tax roll.
Have you, thank you, Mr. Chairman, have there been instances in the case of absentee owners where you've discovered that the address that is listed is not what the primary residence is, or that, if they own several properties all over the country, that you later find out, no, that's the winter home in San Diego, and actually they've been over, wherever, living somewhere else for the last several months, or something to that effect?
I personally have not dealt with it, but when you do the research, yes. There definitely is instances where property is not updated and addresses are not updated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wondered, the chairman had an idea about treating the outer areas that are affecting the other property owners. Could you comment on that, on your thoughts as to that idea?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz. The biggest issue comes into the size of land. If you're talking about a large acreage of rangeland, there could probably be a buffer area for prairie dogs. There could probably be a buffer area for noxious weeds blowing seeds. But when you're dealing with two sections and basically a mile wide by 2 miles long, and it's solid prairie dogs, there is no such thing as a buffer area. And that is the problem, where you go out there and you say this whole area needs to be treated, but then you look at the expense and you don't want to put that burden on that individual, but yet they've got 3 different landowners or 4 different landowners surrounding on all sides. Each of those landowners wants that buffer. There is no buffer. There's no reasonable buffer.
Questions, committee? Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any further public comment on this particular issue? Okay, going once, going twice. Public comment is closed. Committee, you got a potential bill before you. Lots of different ideas, probably something that needs work by definition if it hasn't passed relatively recently. But anyways, I'll entertain any motions that the committee might have.
I'll make the motion to bring this bill forward for the committee to look at again and get a working copy.
Okay, so that's been moved. Seconded by Senator Steinmetz. Any discussion, any amendments we want to make right off the bat to this bill draft? Representative Claus.
So I've got a few amendments, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
So I think we have to strike for certain page 4, lines 16 through 20. And then page 4, the new language between on lines 4 through 9 for certain. Page 3, lines 12 through 16. And put the Strickland language back in on page 2, lines 7 through 11.
Okay. Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. We strike that language. Do you want to explain, Representative Claus, what that would accomplish?
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, the language, page 4, line 16 through 20 would get rid of the liability from the spreads. I think we are opening a big can of worms there that just the nature of certain parts of Wyoming, and it would be completely unmanageable, especially where the federal partners aren't taking care of prairie dogs in particular. Let's see. Automatically, so automatic on page 4, lines 4 through 9 would get rid of the county attorney, let's see, shall refer. There are cases where there could be infested lands that absolutely are not the landowner's fault or the deeded landowner's fault because of federal actions. I don't think we can leave that in for certain parts of the state. And let's see, the gets rid of the deadline on page 3, lines 12 through 16, gets rid of the deadline language, so you don't have it's a short timeline, and I'm not sure that's the fix I wanted going on. Page 2, lines 7 through 11, the stricken language puts back in the lawful entry procedure. I don't think we want to do away with lawful entry for private property. And that's what the amendment basically does.
Okay, fair enough. So we're just talking about what sort of draft we want before us in October, if we do in fact vote to look at this as a committee draft. So any discussion on that amendment? Mr. Co-Chairman, do you have anything? All right.
I don't want to belabor this, but Mr. Chairman, one of the questions I would have going forward is an understanding, I believe it's existing language, but on page 2, line 2, whenever the district board has probable cause to believe, et cetera, and I'm not an attorney, but in the probable cause in the sense of having committed a crime is, and I understand like with municipalities that there are city ordinances that you can be fined for not upkeeping your lawn, for having junk on your lawn, et cetera. But as far as rural areas are concerned, is it a criminal negligence? Is it a crime? Is it a penalty to not take care of this? And so as far as probable cause goes, as far as effectively a search and seizure, I guess I would like to know from the attorneys, from our LSO staff, or from whoever would have that information, is it in that sense that we are discussing probable cause in this context, and effectively does a Weed and Pest Board have effectively law enforcement power to go on one's property to conduct that, even if it's not technically a crime, quote unquote, to not have managed your weeds, your prairie dogs, your whatever. So anyway.
Okay, any further discussion on the amendment? Senator Simons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to address that on page 2, line 2, whenever the district board has probable cause to believe. So that's already in the statute concerning this, so they must have been utilizing that as well.
Okay, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm against his amendment, obviously. I think it pretty much guts the whole bill. Proceed how you want, but I think it needs further discussion, and leave it all in there is what I would say. So I'll be against the amendment.
Okay, any further discussion on the amendment? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of Representative Clausen's amendment, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No. Oh, man. Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 6, it looks like in favor. All those opposed? 1, 2, 3. Keep them up. Okay, so that amendment passes 6-3, it looks like. I think overall, just if I'm going to have a little discussion here, I think, look at the questions I have in my mind is why aren't the county attorneys, why are they having trouble? So we need to get them to weigh in on this issue as a way that we can streamline that process so they're less confused, or they have fewer excuses, I guess, not to do their jobs, as will happen on occasion. And that could be one way of working within the existing statutes. And if we need to clarify the statutes as to, use this particular procedure over the other, that could be useful input. I think we do need the county attorneys here as well, because obviously I don't think any of us are attorneys. Are you attorney? No? Okay, yeah. So I guess obviously that's why we have LSO staff, but we need that input as well. So, it's very complicated. I understand the need and what we're trying to accomplish, but it gets pretty complicated pretty quick when you start throwing in property rights and all these this technical jargon. So I just ask that as if we move forward, that we and throw a very wide loop, just not necessarily just weed and pest or ag-related folks, but also the legal profession as well. So Representative Tass.
Mr. Chairman, could we, I don't know whether this is proper procedure or not, could we table this until the next meeting and until we get a lot more clarification on some of this? This, I can see the need for it, just like the zoning laws in the county, and there are so many people that, you're trying to control somebody else's property through zoning. Here we're trying to control actions on somebody else's property, and I think we're walking on eggshells. So I'd like to table this if that is appropriate. I don't know if it is or not.
Well, I think the motion is to introduce this bill basically as a committee bill. If we're going to do that, we have to vote up or to do that right now. It's not a final action saying we're absolutely going to sponsor it. It's simply saying that we'd be able to consider it as a committee bill, not just a personal bill. So if you vote yes on the motion, we'd have the opportunity to do that effectively, vote up or down at the October meeting, but we'll at least have something before us to vote on. So, yeah. Okay, Senator Simons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to make an amendment on page 4, line 14, and I'm not sure what the account would be, but maybe send that to Department of Ag or someone other than the county school fund would, and I'm not suggesting that, well, maybe even to Weed and Pest to try to take care of the problem rather than go to the school. And so I would look for a second on that motion if you're agreeable.
And so the motion is to strike school fund and insert Weed and Pest district.
Yeah,
Okay.
whatever that fund number is.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, do you have something to say here?
Chairman. Under Constitution, fines like that have to go to the county school fund. It's a constitution.
Okay. So, fair enough. All right, good to know. Okay, any further discussion on whether we want to consider this as a draft committee bill? Okay. You good, Senator? Or?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to support moving it forward. We have taken a lot out of the bill, but I think it gives us a little bit of a framework, and our discussion has been really good to work from and see if we can come to some kind of an agreement on this issue. It is a problem in several of our counties, and I think it's worth the discussion. I'd like the opportunity to work with LSO to make it a little tighter and get to the place where we can agree on it. Thank you.
Representative Larson?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with what she said. At least we can get it on the table, and maybe we can talk about some other amendments to bring some of that back in.
Okay. All right, any further discussion? Okay, that being said, we'll go ahead and vote. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Okay, that motion carries. So we'll have the amended version of this draft bill to consider as a committee draft at our next meeting. Okay, any further discussion on weed and pest matters? Public comment, anything? Okay, all right. Well, we'll go ahead and move on. Committee, we are way ahead of our agenda. Oh, not too far ahead, I guess, so never mind. Yeah, we have 11:30 lunch. So we'll go ahead and break for lunch, come back at 12:30, and we'll start with ADMB. So be back at 12:30. Hope to see you there.